belief that whatever race is not biological, and we should abolish it. We should throw it into the dustbins of forgotten history. And in most abolitionists about race happen to be imaginary non-believers. But you can also say that race is synthetic and still come to a position of abolitionism, which is where I was before I found myself a full-blown skeptic. I was a constructionist eliminatorist. So I think it's important to teach people all of the philosophies of race, because what we're doing now and what we've done to date is co-opt people into viewing race in 4 of those 6 ways, with the express but also unstated purpose of maintaining the problem of racism by doing so, right? If we believe that we have to reconstruct race, whatever it is, that means we're just working to reconstruct racism. We're just trying to make it less bad. And there are plenty of pessimists who would believe that that's the goal, right? Like, we can't eliminate racism or white supremacy, so we've just got to make it less harmful. But my imagination empowers me to see things differently, right? To see a future without the problem. And that's how I come to a place of abolitionism. Because if we abolish the belief in race and practice of assigning races to humans, then that should be understood as synonymous with abolishing the problem of racism. And we can recognize the imaginary nature of race while still recognizing necessarily the reality of racism. We can do 2 things at once, despite popular belief. We can't do 2 things at once. And this is an invitation to do 2 things at once. Yeah.
And let's wrap up with, since your book has come out, your scholarship, you've been a scholar now for 100 years, what have been some of the biggest shocks that you've encountered? What have been some of the biggest, like, I didn't see that coming, whether for good or bad or neutral? What's been just some of the kind of experiences you have experienced as you began to put your work out there for people to consume?
My own ideas surprised my own self. Okay? Like most people, especially in American society, I grew up, we're teaching kids right now in science classes that race is biological, right? So I grew up thinking that race was biological. I had no reason to think otherwise. And when I got to be an undergraduate and I started to study more deeply race and racism, I started to open my mind to the possibility and probability that, like, oh, actually, no, it's a construction, right? It's synthetic. When I found myself at Howard University a few years ago as a PhD student, I started there in 2016 and graduated in 21. I continued my studies, and it was hard, y'all. I was like, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, I was like Smeagol, arguing with myself. Looking at my reflection. Oh, it was rough. I would cry in my advisor's office. No cap. I cried, real tears, in her office, talking about, my brain is showing me this one thing, right? It had brought me to abolitionism about race. But my heart is telling me something else, right? I am a black woman. I'm super proud of that. Everything I love about myself, I attach to my blackness. So what is this that my brain is showing me, right? I was like seriously conflicted. And she was very kind and very gracious, and she told me, you don't have to be a martyr and just stop calling yourself black today because your brain has shown you this, right? But you do have a responsibility to share your ideas unabashedly. Get published, teach, do all the things, right? I couldn't let it go though, because if I'm not one thing, my wife who's sitting in the front will tell you I'm not a hypocrite. So I couldn't recognize the category as being thoroughly pernicious while still upholding the thing, right? The thing that helped me overcome that Smeagol phase that I went through was recognizing, what my brain was showing me was the truth about the category of race, right? That race is a thoroughly pernicious category. Wherever you see a belief in race and the practice of assigning races to the human species, you see genocide, you see unapologetic oppression and subjugation, and that racial identification comes from the outside, from a group that seeks to dominate the other groups, right? That is the history of race and racialization across time and across place. So everything I love about myself is indeed not race, right? Speaking again to the racelessness translator. My boldness, my audacity, my imagination, my love, my compassion, my intelligence. People tell me I'm smart, that I know stuff, right? My creativity, my beauty, right? My swag. I do have swag. It might be hard to see. My wife, I got swag. All of that stuff that I love about Sheena Mason is not race. And once I saw that and truly understood it, and once my heart caught up to my head, I was able to let go, and I haven't looked back ever since. And my sincere hope and invitation with this book is to help more people grapple with race in the same way. And my students call it emotional, intellectual, and spiritual journey, and indeed it is. So I'm inviting all of you to go through a Spiegel phase and learn some stuff. And even if you don't come to the same conclusion, right, it will not be for naught. You will still have learned something inevitably. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mason.
So we're going to put mics in the stands on either side of the tabling here. So for anyone who has questions, we have plenty of time for your questions and comments. I welcome all of them. So just find your way up to a microphone. Especially for the hard of hearing, I know it might be tempting to think, oh, I've got a loud voice I can project. Listen, I'm going to have trouble hearing you. So please just come to the mic if you have something that you want to say. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Okay, hi. Thanks for sharing your brilliantness with all of us. This is wonderful. So as you were talking, I was thinking of, first I was thinking of raceless projects like Sweden and France, where they're like, we don't see race, we don't ascribe race, we don't assign race, and yet I don't think they've succeeded in becoming anti-racist, and I'd like to know your thoughts about that. And then as you were talking, I was starting to think about how some people use this raceless idea to justify colorblindness. And so I'm wondering how you deal with that contention of people saying, well, I don't see race, and we know that that's often a cop-out to not doing the work. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your question and comment. So I tend to the difference between this framework and colorblindness in one of the chapters. The most straightforward way that I can answer, I've lost you, there you are. Straightforward way that I can answer is, the notion of I don't see race sounds like the exact opposite of what I'm saying, right? Because all I'm talking about is race. At the end of the day, I'm saying race is imaginary, right? But since I opened my mouth, I've been talking about race, right? I've been talking about racism. So this is an unabashed full confrontation of the reality of racism and the problem of this category of race. Unlike colorblindness, which we know most of the criticisms of colorblindness come down to the lack of recognition of the problem of racism. This is precisely the exact opposite. So there are a lot of differences to be had. And I would also offer that this framework actually invites more people who profess themselves to be colorblind, who are operating in good faith, right, to come to the table to talk about racism, because it is a more effective means to help those people indeed see the reality of race and racism in ways that other methodologies prevent. So we're confronting colorblindness and extreme color consciousness head on, in ways that bring everyone to the table and allow us to build more bridges to how any of us think about race. Because certainly, to my mind, the whole reason why this framework came into fruition and the reason why I'm so passionate about it, you know, come what may, is because I'm invested in creating a future without the problem of racism. So anyone else, they can try, right? They can try to like co-opt the thing, but it would be, I think, a failed effort, because to me the differences are obvious once you actually engage and learn.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Okay, I understand your concept of what you're saying. My question is, how will you deal with the divide within each, for lack of better, each race? You have within the black community, you know, we have the, as you would say, we co-opt the N-word. And we look at, you know, we have a divide within it. In the white community, you know, you have the quote unquote, they use the term for poor people, or white trash. How would you incorporate all that into your theory of racism?
Asking me the easy questions, another softball. Well, importantly, I came along this journey because I was primarily interested in intra-group dynamics and intra-group problems and fractures. This is a link to pre-order the book, by the way. Just in case I run out of copies out. So I was primarily interested in intra-group dynamics and fractures and working on healing and unification within the same so-called racial group. I was not, like Toni Morrison said, interested in what those white people over there were doing or cared about or thought about, anything that I was interested in studying. I think that genesis of my work is important and something I would like to lift up, because the healing work that has to happen on an intra-group level, right, is a critical component of this, and is something that if you are a person who gets racialized as black, for example, you can take ownership of your own worldview and your own lens and in your own liberation in some ways, because the literature of incarceration and psychological enslavement, right, from the colonialist project is long. This framework, my contention is, helps us free ourselves from a lot of that. And what that means for the future use of like the N-word or something, I have no idea. But I do know that like colorism, right, some gender divides and other isms that happen on an intergroup level can be addressed. Some health problems related to the internalized trauma of racism can be addressed. And this can be done on an individual and collective basis regardless of what anyone else does. So this is my invitation. Come on in.
Hi, this is wonderful. Thank you very much for this. If any of my students are here who have heard me talk about racialization, I just want to say I told you so. So, in my work as an anthropologist, I work with a group of Native American activists who are very concerned about the number of people who falsely claim to be Native American. The scale of this phenomenon is really quite vast. Since the 1960s, at least 1 million, probably closer to 3 million Americans have shifted race, mostly from white to Native American. And when interviewed, they describe how they are very disenfranchised with what whiteness has come to mean. And see it as an empty, spiritually devoid kind of category. And then they will say, well, we have this distant ancestor who's Native American, therefore for Native American, kind of applying the one drop rule, right? Where am I going with this? Okay. From the studies of identities, we know that people need identities of some sort or another, that it's a human universal. In this case, people are giving up the identity white for something else. I also work with Latinx people who are doing this, but I wonder what your thoughts are. What replaces race in your model if this is to succeed?
Thank you for your question. Spoken like a true anthropologist. If one comes to fully understand what I'm saying about race, right, that you'll see in my definition of racism that I present in the book, the belief in race and practice of assigning races to the human species is what reflects and results in desired and undesired hierarchies, social and economic. So to my mind, the question of replacing race is misguided, because that's like saying, what are we gonna replace racism with? You know, I would say nothing. Right?
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, we're not gonna replace racism. Importantly, as a framework, this book is also an invitation to consider that because we tend to view culture, ethnicity, these other aspects of human identity through racializing lenses, that we have constrained and have incorrectly come to think about culture and ethnicity. And my students can attest to this, right? Like we start on the journey of thinking about what identity even is. What kinds of words do we use to describe our identities? How did we come to identify ourselves in these manners? And inevitably, spoiler alert for those of you in my classes currently, inevitably by the end of the semester, most of my students come to think about identity as being something that's assigned externally from the outside, usually with the express intent of subjugating folks, right? Because somebody has to be defining who is in and who is out. And some of the ways that we think about identity are the who's in and who's out in the context in which we live. And so I'm really exploding the very conceptions that underpin what we think race is. And I think that explosion results in a proliferated understanding of our humanness, a proliferated understanding of culture and how culture is formed, and a proliferated and more expanded conception of what ethnicity is, right? And I think in doing that, then we can stem some of the issues that arise because of the constraints of racism. You know, it's not an accident that people feel increasingly, I think, constrained by the category of race. That's not an accident. Just as people feel constrained by the category of gender, as Dr. Ashford pointed out, right? And often while speaking the language of fluidity, right, and social construction, but in practice, we treat the category of race in particular as identity, as essence, as like an integral part of our bodies and our beings and all of the things. And in that way, we've come to accept the entrenched nature of racism itself. And this is an invitation to get outside of that. And then I think we would stop having so many issues of people, I don't know, feeling the need to like change, because like, let's all be free together from white supremacy, right? And I have friends in Australia who do work and who found my work, and they tell me that that same problem that you identified is happening there too, increasingly. So I would just point out that's a result of the structure of racism and the effects of racism, and it doesn't have to be that way. we can have freer conceptions of ourselves and each other. Hello.
Thank you so much, Sheena. And that was I loved the fireside chat format and the conversation. I'm so excited to read this book. And I think I'll find out more about my question when I do, but I thought I would ask in this forum anyway. I'm really interested in the categories from philosophy that you're using, you know, constructive versus imaginary in particular, because, you know, I've identified as a constructivist. And I think of the history of deconstruction with that. Like if something is made, it can be destroyed. So you're wearing that jacket, I could destroy that jacket, right? And then it wouldn't exist anymore. So I'm wondering about why, you know, the category of the imaginary seems to give you something that, to me, I thought like, oh, well, construction kind of does that because you can unmake something that's made. So I'm just curious about like what that term does for you and a little bit more about that distinction.
Thank you so much. That's a great question, Rachel. So a few things, right? I accidentally found myself in the imaginary category, so it wasn't like something that I intentionally sought after. And I arrived there for some of the reasons that I've already expressed, like, Dr. Mace, what about this? This is race. Skin color is race. Hair texture is race. The kind of music you like is race, right? Fashion is race, et cetera, et cetera. No. I can always translate it. You give me anything, and I can always translate it into something else. I can always demask the Scooby-Doo villain. So to me, that's how I arrived at the imaginary category. But the reason why I think it's critical and more effective to invite folks to explore from this place of imaginariness, if you will, when studying the history in the problem of racism, is because of the barriers that we've been talking about, right? The barrier of whiteness. Even as a construction, whiteness continues to be a barrier, such that people will shed blood before giving up what they view as a critical part of their lives, even on a subconscious level. And if it's imaginary, now we can talk about in this sort of abstract or metaphorical way the problem of whiteness without people feeling entrenched in their position about race or the supposed non-reality of racism. Like some of those barriers that really are barriers